welcome to From the Files of Dr. Mack, hosted by J.J. McCollister. The heritage portion of interests, Blacks in the Bible, Her Story, includes women in the Bible, prominent issues which can be handled with biblical Christian counseling, as well as comments regarding current media content regarding women. And now, Dr. Mack.
Hello, welcome to From the Biblical Files of Dr. Mack. I'm your host today. We're going to continue our series of Blacks in the Bible. Our focus will be on Zipporoah, who was the wife of Moses, the Cushite wife, the Egyptian wife, the Ethiopian wife, the black-skinned wife of Moses. That is part one. As we discuss Zipporoah, we'll be looking at 5 incidents from the book of Exodus. We'll take a look at the meeting at the well. That's incident 1. Incident 2, the encounter with the angel on the way to Egypt. Incident 3, the reunion between Zipporoah and Moses. Incident 4, criticism from Miriam and Aaron. And incident 5, the uncertainty or the uncertain future of Zipporoah. That's part 1 of our webcast today. Part 2, we'll look at the absence of the book of Exodus from the slave Bibles. We mentioned that during our first webcast, and we want to explore it a little bit more today. Well, Moses is the traditional author who is credited, or the human author, as they say, who is credited with authoring or writing the book of Exodus, which is part of the Torah. It's also known as the Law of Moses. It doesn't necessarily mean that he wrote every line of this book, but it does mean that he is the human character who is involved. Since Moses is on the receiving end of directives from God. So that's who our author is. We're working on the fact that this story begins where Genesis ends. And we again are going to be working with the descendants of Abraham and Keturah. And Keturah is the one we spoke of last week, who was referred to as Hagar. Now, the setting or the frame or the background for Zipporoah's story is in the book of Exodus. Now, Exodus itself is a story of God rescuing the children of Israel from Egypt and forging a special relationship with them. Exodus is the second book of the laws of Moses, and we find in it, the story of the 10 plagues, the first Passover, the parting of the Red Sea, the deliverance of the 10 commandments. Now, that's the general setting. We're going to talk a little bit more specifically about where Zipporoah and Moses are. Now, a lot of the scholars will say, well, God sent Moses on a journey or on a school, and he landed in the land of Midian, and that's our primary setting. But we will have the land of Midian, which is sort of a hilly country, peaceful-like, but we will also have the deserts, because there will be an encampment where Moses is with the people, and actually where God actually speaks to them, where Yahweh speaks to them. And then we have the end, where the encounter occurs. Well, after Moses thought that he could deliver Israel by himself with the killing of a slave driver, whom he buried in the sand, and he fled. So he thought no one knew, but the next day when he went out, I love this particular part. It says, well, who do you think you are? He's afforded or accosted by an Israeli. Who made you king? Who do you think you are? So he ran again. This time he left Egypt and went to the land of Midian. And he left the soil of Egypt and went to this mountainous country. And if you want to know where that is, try Exodus 2nd chapter 15 verse. So Midian is sort of part of Mount Sinai, or at least in that neighborhood. There he encountered um, a very interesting situation. I know most of you think of shepherds as men, and that's true, but we want to talk about one who actually, seven who are actually women. They are shepherdess. So they are taking their sheep, their flock, to water them at a well. And what happens is while they are approaching, they see a stranger at the well. But at the same time, they are accosted by shepherds who are like going to force them away. Now, it doesn't say in the scripture how many times this incident had occurred, but we have a champion there, this stranger defends them, and he drives the shepherds away, and they are able to. Actually, he, according to most scripture, he actually watered the flock. So when they returned home, and we meet our first other character, Jethro, who is a priest of Midian, who is the father of these seven daughters, he wants to know why they're a little bit early, and they tell the story of the stranger who was sitting by the well and who defended them against the persons who challenged them for the water and who aided them and vanquished those who were trying to really bully them. That's the best way to put it. So we um, we have in there this whole concept of hospitality. We're going to have little themes and big themes today. So it was something that was commonly exercised in the Old Testament, and if you take a look at Second Timothy, third chapter and 11th verse, you'll see where there's a note where one should be hospitable, but not too large. Those persons who are sponging upon them, who are not hardworking people. But Jethro and his daughters were hardworking people. And Jethro said to them, like, where is he? Okay, we have not exchanged a name yet in scripture between the two. And why have you left this man? So call him and we'll let him eat bread with us. So we're looking at Exodus 2nd chapter 20th verse. So God has already provided his servant a home in a strange land. And Moses was highly cultivated. However, he is mistaken here as sort of a low class. He's a prince. Remember, he was adopted by the daughter of Pharaoh. Here he's just seen as a stranger and even maybe someone of a lower caste. But during the meal and during the time there, he becomes part of the family. And I have to mention, I love those scriptures where they say, and Jethro gave Zipporoah to Moses as wife. Well, it wasn't that easy. You got to go back and remember your story of Jacob. Here we're talking about shepherds. Moses had no bride price, he had no dowry, so what he did is he worked for Jethro. He tended the sheep, and he also was able to amass a flock for himself. So that is the way that dowry or bride price was exchanged. But as we go on, we work on the assumption that Zipporoah learned from Moses, later, definitely later, to fear the true God. And again, I sort of like this because her father is considered the founder of a religion, and the location being in the mountains, but at the same time in a hospitable place where there's water flowing, because water was the center of activity there. Not only was it the center of activity, it was necessary, for the social interactions, yes, but for the livelihood, the watering of the sheep. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, the book of Exodus gets its name from the nation of Israel's mass immigration from Egypt. And that's part of the story that's told. But the other part is what happens to them while they're in the desert. Um, and if you remember your scripture right, you'll notice that it didn't go as it should have in the desert. But it is also where God lays out his first expectations for the people of Israel. And those expectations basically came in the form of the Ten Commandments. Now, they were to meet those expectations, and when they failed to meet them, there would be punishment. And that's basically what we have in Exodus. The basic characters, even in the story of Zipporoah and Moses, would be God, Yahweh, Moses, who is the character that we meet at the well, the person who is a fugitive from Pharaoh, although he grew up in the house of Pharaoh. He and he's going to be one called by God. Moses' brother Aaron, and we have some Pharaoh interactions there later on. What are the key themes in the book of Exodus? Well, it's about making Israel his own. He has decided that these descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who were made promises to back in Genesis, would be the chosen people. So as we go through here with the verse that sums up the theme of Exodus, it says, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." That is the broad theme that we have here. Exodus 20th chapter, second verse. But in order for that to be done, we have some other, what I would like to call secondary or minor themes. We have the theme of redemption. He heard their cries, he answered them. We have the covenant, which we just talked about, the laws that he's going to give. Then we have God's presence. And we have it, the only other place in the Bible for me that his presence is so pronounced and so interesting is the conversion on the road, to Tarsus. But here we don't have that. With Moses, it comes in the form of a burning bush. So what we have as we go through the the other thing that we have is the law, which we talked about the book itself being the law of Moses. Now, one of the ways that I have of remembering this is to divide it up into three parts. The first part, Exodus chapters 1 and 2, I think of them as the prologue, because here we have um, a young nation, really. I'm not really sure we should call it a nation, but we have a new Pharaoh who doesn't remember any of the things that were done by Joseph. And the fact that the Hebrew slaves are multiplying so fast, he feels threatened by them. And then you know the story of the midwives, the two women midwives he sent out to kill the babies. But guess what? This particular character isn't killed. And it's a good thing because we wouldn't have the story of Zipporoah. And then the second part of that is God saved Israel. So I would look in chapters 3 through 19, and that's 40 years that passed here, uh, because that's when Moses encounters God in the burning bush. Then we go down and we get to that third part where God makes a covenant with Israel, chapters 20 to 40. And we won't talk too much about those, but we will have to mention them. Now, the characters for the specific story that we're talking about today, uh, or Moses, God, Jethro, Zephronia, Grisham, Eleazar, Aaron, Miriam, Pharaoh, and the angel. And the conflicts are man versus man, we know that. Man versus nature, man versus something within himself, and man versus the supernatural. That definitely is in Incident 2, where we have the situation at the end. And if you want to see the bulk of the story, you need to look at Exodus chapters 2, um, verse 11, and chapter 4, verse 31. And then you need to go over to Numbers chapter 12, verse 1. Now, we already know, I've already shared that you have someone on the run, and our heroine this time is the daughter of a priest, but she's also a shepherdess whose task it was is to basically to take care of the sheep because they were part of everything that was needed. And in that part of Israel, women did work outside of the home, and it's important that you remember that. But the fact that the stranger, the foreigner, stood up and he helped them and he watered their flock in Exodus second chapter verse 17, it becomes a very bold step. And the fact that she went home and she shared it with her dad becomes something important because You have other verses in there that will sort of support how that life that came in existence. But let's take a minute to take a look at her duties as a shepherdess. If you wanted to say to yourself, okay, well, what do they do? I know not Joseph. I know that when we're reading the story of Jacob, we know about his intended. You know, Rachel and Leah were both shepherdess in the Bible. But in addition to caring for the sheep, um, they had to have certain characteristics. And we're talking about a time period. It was in 300 and the 19th year after Abraham entered Canaan. Okay, that this is occurring, and we have already experienced this. So as we go through, and we want to just say to him, okay, other than watering the sheep, taking them, bringing them back home, making sure the pastures, PASTURS, the pastures were green enough to survive, them and take care of them. What else did she have to do? Well, it's important that she remembered that that she remembered that this was not just her womanly duty, but it was outside work. Now, in the home, she was concerned with the spinning of the wool, and the preparation of meals. But there were some cons to working as a shepherdess, and those things were that you were sometimes accosted by men at the watering, where the water was. You had to be aware of that, but you also had to remember that there were danger to the sheep. You had to protect the flock, um, as it were, from harm and danger, because you had to know that it's important that it was part of the family livelihood. So in this era, we had to think of them as having basically two jobs, very much like today. You can work at the home, you can work outside the home. So it was important that she would be a good shepherd. It's very important that she was going to become a good shepherd who's characterized herself as being patient. She had wisdom, she had courage, she had a great deal of love. And she understood hard work and commitment and dedication. And she was willing to put the flock, the need of the flocks ahead of her own concern because more than one person was involved. So, as we go through, we can say that as a shepherdess, in a historical point of view, we have to say that they played a crucial role in the economy of the country and an economy of the family. They were also symbols and metaphors in the Bible representing God's care and guidance. Because you can name several characters who were shepherds as well as shepherdess. They served as protectors and leaders, exemplifying their compassion and their understanding and their patience. And when you talk about a shepherd or a shepherdess, I think in terms of peace and tranquility, uh, reminding us that God's nature and loving nature, and that He always is there to offer us faith, hope, and love in a time of uncertainty. I sort of want you to stop a second and think in terms of leaving Egypt, encountering, crossing the desert, after having buried the guy you killed, crossing the desert, coming into Midian, where you find the Zipporoah's homeland. And Moses spending 40 years there, not worrying about things that he had grown up with, but also being a foreigner. So you can put over here his past life and then put his present life here, where you do have uh, faith and hope and tranquility. Because as a shepherd, he had time, lots of time to contemplate those things. All right, let's take a look at Exodus 2, chapter 2, verses 15 to 21. Now, in these verses, that's where we have the flight situation, and we know that he was 40 years there in the wilderness, and we also know that he did some things that, well, the murder, that's one thing, and then the punishment from the Pharaoh. Now you have, whenever I read and decide to share, I have to look at those who are critical of the character and those who are praising the character. Their There are some who wrote that Zipporoah was not a good person, that she was quarrelsome, that she was self-willed, that eventually she decided she didn't like Moses as much as she thought she was going to like him. And it was one of those situations where the marriage was not pleasant. Now, this is just one author. I went through many, many authors, and only one, was able to say that. But the character of Zephora is really expressed like in Exodus 4, chapter 4, verse 24. And we actually see as that shepherdess in her father's house, because Moses and Zephora and their two sons stayed under the authority of Jethro. And I like this too. After he was given Zipporah in marriage, um, he became not only a member of the family, but he became a member of the tribe. He was adopted. Now we have to remember, not spending too much time on Moses. Moses, as a baby, was taken away from his home, but his mother was his nursemaid. So there are things that he didn't know. And we're going to have to talk about one of those things that causes the incident at the end. So, without knowing this, Zipporah's husband, Moses, is supposed to become the leader of the nation because he witnessed the cruelty of the Egyptians towards the people that he know are his people. So, he has to learn to be obedient in all things. So, she feared that her husband was going to be slain, and she had to perform a rite that she didn't quite, and rite, R-I-T-E, that she wasn't sure she would be able to do, but she knew that she had to do because it was something that was required. It was one of the covenant things. We're looking at verse 21, beginning to look at verse 21 as we go through here. After that meeting, the marriage, the children, he named his sons as he was feeling. Grisham is a foreigner, I'm a foreigner. And we had that situation with Hagar last week. And Eleazar, the God of my fathers, the God of my people. So he's beginning to see things that he needs to see as we go through. Now, he here we have the miracle thing. We have the incident of the burning bush. Now he's out taking care of his flock on the side of a hill, and his father-in-law's flock. Um, and he hears a voice in the burning bush, and he's told what he needs to do. Um, and he's told that he needs to go back and he needs to speak to God. Tells him you need to go back and talk to Pharaoh. I like this really, really well because we get the dialogue in there and he get his excuses. I'm not elegant, so God took care of that problem. He brought in his older brother um, Aaron to do that. So we're pretty much finished because God doesn't. He's just giving you what you need, and He always will. Remember our theme of redemption. Remember our theme of covenant. Those are God's, and we're experiencing at this point God's presence. So as we go into incident number 2, it's important that we look at the end. So he goes to Jethro to get incident number 2, and he tells him, he relays what has happened to him, and he gets permission because now Jethro being the priest, and he gets permission to go, and he takes with him Sephora and his 2 children, and on the way they stop. They stop at an inn. But Moses is suddenly stricken. Um, some of the writers say it's a seizure, some of them say it's something else. But anyway, he's unable to function. And as a good wife, uh, Zipporah, and we've given you her characteristics, she knows immediately what's going to happen. So we're looking at Exodus chapter 4, verses 24 to 26, where he says, "And it came to pass at the encampment in that the Lord met him and sought to kill Moses." There are those who say, oh, wait, this doesn't fit in there. But it does. If you just take the literal and not try to make it more and more than it is. Because God is holding Moses accountable for breaking the covenant, which was given back in Genesis 17 and 14. We talked a little bit about it last week, where God tells Abraham, I'm making the covenant, and the sign of the covenant was what? He had to do the circumcision on Isaac, and the same day Isaac was circumcised, Abraham was circumcised, and all of the men who were with him were circumcised. Okay? Because of the age of the child. We don't know how old Grissom is at this point, but we do know that he is not circumcised. Okay? Now that gets into a situation of, okay, whose fault is it? Now, because so much of the Bible was translated by men, guess what? They said, well, Zipporoah did it. She didn't want it done, because they're not totally into Yahweh at this point, and they had their own rules. So for those of you who are going to be a little bit put off, I have to talk about the Hebrew circumcision and the fact that it was to occur 8 days after the birth of a male child. I have to talk about the Egyptian circumcision, and you got to remember now the circumcision of Isaac was done when he was he was older too, you know. Um, and then we have the group that the circumcision is done around 13 and 14. And that is historically your Egyptian situation going on. And then you have the Midianite circumcision. They also did that. And to completely confuse you, we could get in there with the second circumcisions that are talked about in the book of Joshua. But we'll try not to talk about them at all and just stay with what we're dealing with here, Zipporoah. Zipporoah, who at this point is no longer the stranger who helps the foreigner, who is Moses, who becomes a wife. She takes on the role of a priest at this point because she immediately recognizes that, oh, wow, you know what? The circumcision hasn't occurred. And she does it herself. But she does it with the flint knife. Some translations say picked up a rock, but if you go back far enough, you'll see this was a knife made out of a rock, made out of flint, and she actually did complete the circumcision herself. Now, there's no document there that she had witnessed her father doing it or anything, but she knew that she had to do something in order to save Moses. So if you want to get into it and confuse yourself, you can, but I won't get caught up into, surely you are the husband of blood to me. We're not going to get caught up in that. We're going to say, okay, you did what needed to be done in order to save him. And this is the interest of the angel, because the angel does come, and this is where Moses' life is at stake. And after the circumcision is complete, guess what? Angel goes away, and we have that exodus of Zipporoah, who he sends back to her dad, sends her back with the two children to her dad. And this is where we also meet Aaron. I mentioned that he's going to be a character here. And he's there, and he wants to know who are these people you brought with you. And he says, this is a woman I married in Midian, and these are my sons. And Aaron says, in essence, and this is paraphrasing, I mean, we have all these people in Egypt, and the situation is already bad, So, you're bringing them into this situation. Now, there's no inference that he's doing it for Zipporoah or his nephews. It's just that, they need to go back. So Moses adheres to that, and they go back. And it doesn't really say that the attitude of Zipporoah is bad or anything like that, because she followed what her husband asked her to do. So as we go through, we find it very interesting that this has to happen, and it is done. And his older son is circumcised. And for those of you who just want to talk about the blood, the husband blood and all of that, she does put it on his feet, quote unquote. But if you look at that, it's not feet. It's sort of it's a nice way of talking about his genitals. She placed the foreskin that she had removed, and she put it on Moses' genital, which actually, guess what? It became symbolic of him being circumcised as well as the son being circumcised, and both of them at this point are within the covenant of Abraham that was supposed to occur. So it's exciting when you want to look at it like that and not really get into all of that. Oh, we were talking a few minutes about when the circumcision had to occur, we did talk about the 8 days. We talked about the age 14 with the Egyptian, but the Mennonites were circumcised uh, prior to their marriage, sort of when they got engaged. They were circumcised at that point, and then 3 days later they could marry after the recuperation and all of that. Now, what does Zipporah's act of faith do? And we're still in Exodus 4, verses 24 and 26. She demonstrates her faith in God. That's basically what she does. And she is willing to protect her family, even when faced with life threatening situations. What did we say the shepherdess had to be? Zipporah becomes this. Just as she would have protected her flock, she protects her family. She protects the family. And true enough, it was a strange circumcision. Women didn't do circumcisions, although they were present. Israeli women were present at the circumcision, but they didn't do them. But she did what was absolutely needed to do. She becomes a human actor here, and even though it's a divine attack on her son, and she does what any mother would do, whatever needed to be done to save her son. Now, the words could have been spoken in anger, but here you get an indication that they discussed this before, because according to her custom, it was early and it's being done for an infant, so you had to let that go. So she knew precisely what to do in order to appease the Lord's anger because that discussion had occurred. As we continue to go through here and talk about and think about what had to be done, we have to remember that just basically it's part of the covenant that was done. And I don't really blame Moses in a way because his mom, his Israeli mom was his nursemaid, but he had grown up in the house of the Egyptians, the house of Pharaoh. So it he may or may not have been circumcised, and he may or may not have been, he would not have been circumcised as was done as was prescribed by God to Abraham. The Israelis just did a split in the foreskin. I'm sorry, the Israelis removed the foreskins. The Egyptians only did a split in the foreskin. So that's why we won't get to Joshua with his second circumcisions and all of that stuff. But there are two practical takeaways that we can do here from the circumcision. Okay, the lessons we can take away. Leadership begins at home. So I am not going to blame Moses for not doing it because it's a possibility he was unaware, but he was an educated man. And the second possibility is that faith makes an ordinance effective. If it's something you have to do, you pray, you have the faith, and you go ahead and you do it. But her quick thinking saved the life of Moses. So we'll move on down to the third one. Moses and Aaron goes on, and then later we have the return where Zipporoah and the two sons are brought right by um, her father Jethro. And we're not going to focus on Jethro, but Jethro was instrumental in helping him set up the legal system and the governmental systems. There's that phrase in there where it says, I believe it's verse 23 or so, where it says, "You take too much upon yourself," to Moses, and Moses appointed 70 persons who were going to help him carry it out. But in this situation where we have that return visit, or yeah, the meeting again of Zephora and you got to remember now, we're talking about maybe a year or so that's passing here. We have these large chunks of time that just move as they go, and you have to say to yourself, okay, how does this marriage hold up? But it does, or it appears to hold up at that point. Once she's in the encampment and Moses is listening to the father and, getting the advice that he needs, she does stay there. She stays there, but she she doesn't stay there that long because she again goes away back to her father's house. And then we find the criticism coming up in the next incident, which is the criticism of Miriam and Aaron. And here we have a really interesting situation. And the word Cushite or the word Egyptian is used in such a negative way. It's like saying, the N word for us. The offense would be just that great. Um, so, and as we're reading this, we're saying to, you know, Miriam is saying to Aaron, sort of complaining. To be honest with you, I call it criticism, but basically it's complaining against her. Why is she, why did he marry her and all this stuff? So it's really not any of the things that Miriam should have been complaining against. And here's your bottom line. Many of the scholars believe it wasn't against Zipporoah because her skin was darker, because she's the daughter of a priest. She has outstanding characteristics. She's proven she'll do whatever she needs to do to stand by Moses. It's jealousy. When Zipporoah was away, then Miriam was the top lady in the camp. And she had been, remember, Miriam in the wilderness, the dancing with the tamarines and all that. But she did complaining. But notice she's the one that went to Moses. It was Aaron who went to Moses. But God punished her, turned her to leprosy, turned her to being totally white, at least for a week. And then Aaron went back and Moses interceded. But here we still have the fact that Zipporoah was a topic of conversation and she should not have been. But if you read back or go back to the Torah and you take a look, and you'll find out he had appointed these 70 persons who were going to be working throughout the camp, because they're at the camp now, because God is already going to come down and he's going to talk to them, and Moses is going to get 10 commandments. So she's there, and the women are talking, and when they're talking about the wives of these new guys who were just appointed. And she's talking, she basically says, and I don't know if she said it loud enough or she just mumbled to herself, she sort of had pity on the wives because they were going to be forsaken just as Moses had forsaken her, sort of pushed her aside. And here you get your first indication going forward that he is to be the leader. He is the designated one, because we're going to encounter, when we talk about her future, we're going to encounter that separation again. Although it's not clear, but we're going to encounter it again. So as she's talking to him, does she leave on her own? Or is there a conversation between the two of them? It's really not clear. Because her saying that these new wives of these new people that were appointed by Moses, they're going to be alone. And then the translation says, as Moses has separated from me. Not that she separated, but as Moses had separated from them. So the answer is, was it racism? We don't know. Did Miriam and Aaron have something against the black-skinned Africans who were there? Because all throughout the Bible, and as we'll see in this series, they are part of God's plan. There's nothing that says that they are not part of God's plan. They are. And as we talk about the slave Bible in just a moment, you'll see that they were supposed to be there. So this is where she understands that she's no longer she's not the wife. He's the leader. Definitely not the wife. And if you want to politely put it, the conversation was about Moses marrying a non-Israelite. Well, in essence, it wasn't. It was a jealousy. Why is God only speaking to him? Why is he speaking to Moses? But then God said he would be from mouth to mouth to Moses. So it goes on from there. And then we get that little confusion in there about whether this is Zipporoah that they're talking about, the Cushite wife, or is it another woman who's the Cushite wife. But her role in Exodus, Zipporah's role in Exodus, emphasizes the significance of women in sharing the course of history. Her courage, her wisdom, her faith, contributed to the success that Moses had in leadership and the liberation of the Israelites. She understood the challenges and she supported as she was there. What does she do? Basically, when I think of Zipporoah, I think in terms of a woman, a black woman who embraced her diversity, navigated the challenges, understood a new faith, and she was determined to recognize this transformative thing that had occurred to her when she understood the power of God's grace. And so there are many things we can say about her, but we have to know those things. This conflict is in Numbers 12, chapter 1. That's that criticism of Moses and, not, yeah, criticism of Moses by Aaron and Miriam. Now, the last incident that we wanted to talk about, her future. What happened to her? Well, I just said she had an uncertain future. So, as an Ethiopian, as a Cushite. We don't know whether she passed away or she returned to her father to live the rest of her life, but we do know that we have no record of where she died. So we know that Moses spent 40 years leading the Israelites through the wilderness, and that he didn't go into the land. We know that we know these things from Scripture. We know that his wife was a Mennonite, and they were descendants of Abraham and Keturah, Genesis 25 verses 1 through 4, and that they lived in Sinai, and that she was there for all those things that happened. We know that the derogatory use of Cushite was not something that should have happened. We don't know where she's buried. We don't know how old she was when she died. We have no idea because Scripture doesn't tell us that where she died. But most scholars, excuse me, agree that she died of old age. But you have nothing historical to hang that on. But Moses died at the age of, Moses died at the age of 120. So we have that. So let's run into part two before our time runs out. Why is the book of Exodus missing from the missing from the slave Bible? The first slave Bible was published in 1807 because you had missionaries who felt that it was their duty to, Christianize, share the word, to teach the Africans and the Africans to read. We know that. So it was made in 1807 and it was distributed by the missionaries. But you got to remember, at the time it was distributed, it was just 3 years removed from a Haitian revolt that had occurred, and it's the only time in history that the slaves actually pushed out all the persons who were enslaving them. Now, they keep the story of Joseph's enslavement in the Bible, and you know why? Because we're talking Genesis 39, verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. So you can imagine they wanted to hear that. You have an enslaved person, and who quote unquote was sort of happy. But the whole purpose of the slave Bible was to highlight the themes of being submissive. You had to take a look at that, and it's not a good look. Those missionaries, we talked about what their theme was and what they wanted to do, but in a biblical context, it was not, especially during the 17th through 19th centuries. It was there, baby. I like to call it propaganda. You know, I'll read you this, but I'm going to leave it out. There's one author who says that 80 to 90% of the Bible was left out because it would have encouraged the slaves to protest against it. Candace Lucy is one of the persons who wrote extensively about it. And then there are three full copies of the Slave Bible. And one was on loan for the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C., but they're basically all at Fisk University. So if you're ever in that area, you might want to take a look at it. The idea, the idea, back in the 1807 was that um, we want them to have the Christianity because we're using some of the Christianity to keep them in slaves. But the slave Bible doesn't include Moses heading the Israelites to freedom. It doesn't include that, but it does include Joseph enslavement, what we said a little bit earlier. Um, and there were sermons given to them about how Joseph accepted his lot in life, how he kept his faith in God, and how he was rewarded at the end. But the passages are basically used to keep people down, not to build them up. The passages that were full of hope and faith, or the fact that you would have life better than what you have now, those were the passages that were excluded. They were excluded. Um, so uh, we have to go back and take a look at. You say, well, how are you going to? Well, Zipporoah is automatically referred to as an Egyptian or a Cushite or black skin. So we don't have to go through. But what we can do is remember the diversity of ethnic groups in Israel, in ancient Israel. They were all there, the Egyptians and all of the descendants of basically Noah. We had them all there. So the so-called curse of Ham was still prevalent in some, and there the thing against intermarriage is there. So if we look at it, Exodus 12th chapter, verse 38, when God delivered Israel from Egypt, the Bible mentions that the ethnicity diverse crowd went with them. So all colors were there. Um, this term indicates that the group Moses led out of Egypt and into the covenant relationship with God was ethnically diverse. You know, again, coming from Abraham. There's so much more to say about that, and we'll get to talk about the interethnic marriage a little bit more because we did have an Israelite slash Egyptian married an African slash Meridian. I really hope you've enjoyed today's presentation, and we'll meet again on Wednesday where we'll move from the book of Exodus into the book of Leviticus. Thank you for joining us.